There's a photograph taken backstage at the Monterey International Pop Festival on June 17, 1967, that shows two men standing together in a moment between performances, both still carrying the energy and sweat from stages they've just left. One is Otis Redding, 25 years old, dressed in a green suit that's wrinkled from the intensity of his performance, his face still showing the exhaustion and exhilaration of giving everything he has to an audience that didn't know what hit them. The other is Jimi Hendrix, 24 years old, wearing the psychedelic clothing and wild hair that would become iconic, holding a Stratocaster that still smells faintly of lighter fluid from the burning that had happened an hour earlier. They're talking, these two men, their body language suggesting genuine connection and mutual respect, rather than the polite professional courtesy that musicians often show each other at festivals. Otis is saying something, his hand on Jimi's shoulder, his expression serious and intense. Jimi is listening with complete attention, not the performative listening of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but the focused absorption of someone recognizing that what's being said matters, that this moment holds significance beyond casual backstage conversation. The photographer who captured this image didn't record what Otis was saying. The witnesses standing close enough to hear were musicians and crew members focused on their own concerns, not paying careful attention to a private conversation between two artists. And when Otis died 6 months later, in a plane crash that would rob music of one of its greatest voices, just as he was reaching the peak of his commercial success and artistic powers, whatever he said to Jimi in that moment was lost, becoming one of music history's permanent mysteries, a piece of wisdom or recognition or human connection that we can see happening but cannot hear. But the people who were backstage at Monterey that weekend, who watched both performances and observed the interactions afterward, who saw how these two revolutionary artists from completely different musical traditions recognized something essential in each other, later spoke about that encounter with a sense that something important had been exchanged, that Otis had seen something in Jimi's performance and in his approach to music that demanded acknowledgement and response, and that what he said in that moment represented more than just compliments or professional courtesy, but genuine artistic recognition, crossing boundaries of genre and race and commercial expectation. Before we step into that extraordinary weekend when soul music's greatest voice and rock guitar's most innovative artist both transformed American music on the same stage within hours of each other, and when something was said between them that witnesses describe as profound but cannot precisely remember, hit subscribe, because what follows comes from the musicians who watched both performances, from the people who saw that backstage conversation, from the photographers who documented the festival, and from those who understood that June 1967 at Monterey represented a moment when American music changed direction permanently, and when two artists whose careers would be tragically brief recognized in each other, something that transcended the categories the music industry used to separate and diminish them. June 16th to 18th, 1967. The Monterey County Fairgrounds in California hosts what will become one of the most significant music events in American history, the Monterey International Pop Festival. 3 days of performances that bring together established acts and emerging artists in a combination that represents both where popular music has been and where it's heading. The festival is organized by John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas, Lou Adler, and other music industry figures who envision something unprecedented in scale and ambition. A gathering that will document the transformation happening in American music as folk and rock and soul and psychedelia begin crossing boundaries and creating new forms. The festival's significance comes partly from its lineup, which includes Janis Joplin, The Who, The Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, Ravi Shankar, and dozens of other acts representing the breadth of what's possible in 1967. But more importantly, the festival represents a moment when the boundaries between different musical communities begin dissolving, when folk audiences and rock audiences and soul audiences and psychedelic audiences occupy the same space and experience music outside their normal categorical preferences, when the segregation that had kept different types of music separated begins breaking down in ways that will reshape American popular culture. For Otis Redding, Monterey represents both opportunity and enormous risk. Otis in June 1967 is established royalty within soul and R&B communities, a vocalist and performer whose power and emotional authenticity have made him one of Stax Records' most successful artists and one of the most respected singers in American music. His success has been primarily with black audiences and on R&B charts, his music celebrated within communities that understand and value the tradition he represents, but not yet breaking through to the mainstream white rock audiences that control the larger commercial markets and media attention. The decision to perform at Monterey comes after significant internal debate and external encouragement. Otis's management recognizes that the festival provides unprecedented opportunity to reach audiences who wouldn't normally attend soul shows or buy R&B records. That successful performance at Monterey could transform Otis from an R&B star into a crossover phenomenon with access to rock markets and mainstream media coverage. But there's also substantial risk. The Monterey audience will be predominantly white, predominantly young, predominantly oriented toward rock and psychedelia rather than soul and R&B. If Otis's performance doesn't connect, if his approach feels too traditional or too tied to older musical forms, he could be dismissed or ignored by an audience whose approval he's seeking. There's also the psychological challenge of performing for an audience that Otis knows doesn't understand the tradition he represents, that may not recognize the sophistication and innovation in what he's doing because they lack context to evaluate it properly. Soul music in 1967 is regularly dismissed by rock critics and white audiences as primitive or emotionally excessive, as music that relies on vocal pyrotechnics and emotional display, rather than on the compositional sophistication and intellectual engagement that rock increasingly claims for itself. Otis knows he'll be performing for people whose prejudices may prevent them from hearing what he's actually doing, who may judge his music according to rock's standards rather than appreciating it on its own terms. For Jimi Hendrix, Monterey represents a different kind of opportunity and risk. Jimi arrives at the festival with significant momentum from his London success, but still virtually unknown to American audiences despite being American himself. His exile to London had been necessary because American music industry and American audiences in 1966 hadn't been ready for what he was attempting, hadn't had categories or frameworks to understand a black guitarist playing experimental rock that drew on blues and R&B traditions, but transformed them into something that didn't fit existing genres or market segments. The British embrace of Jimi had provided validation and success, proving that his approach worked and that audiences existed who could appreciate what he was doing. But America remained the crucial market, the place where commercial success was measured and where cultural impact ultimately got determined. Monterey offers the opportunity to introduce himself to American audiences on his own terms, to demonstrate that the British success wasn't fluke or novelty, but represented genuine innovation that American audiences should recognize and embrace. The risk for Jimi is different from Otis's risk, but equally significant. Jimi is attempting something that doesn't fit neatly into existing categories, playing rock music while being black at a moment when rock is increasingly coded as white music, and when black musicians are expected to play soul or R&B or jazz. His experimental approach and psychedelic style could be dismissed as gimmickry or as appropriation, as someone borrowing from blues traditions without respecting them, or as someone trying to be white by playing rock rather than staying within the musical forms his race is expected to occupy. And if his performance at Monterey fails to connect, if American audiences prove as resistant as they'd been before London, then the momentum from British success could dissipate without ever translating into American achievement. Both artists arrive at Monterey carrying the weight of representation and expectation that comes from being among the few black performers on a lineup dominated by white rock acts, from being positioned to prove that soul music and experimental rock deserve recognition and respect from audiences whose attention and approval they're seeking. Both understand that their performances will be judged not just as individual artistic statements, but as representatives of entire musical traditions. That success or failure will reflect on more than just their personal careers. The festival schedule places their performances strategically across the 3 days. Otis performs on Saturday night, June 17th, in a prime evening slot that demonstrates the organizers' respect for his stature and their recognition that his performance will be one of the weekend's highlights. Jimi performs on Sunday night, June 18th, in the festival's closing hours, positioned as the climactic finale that will send audiences home with a final indelible image and experience. The separation means they won't directly compete for attention, but it also means they'll experience the same audience from different positions in the festival's arc, Otis helping establish the weekend's emotional intensity, Jimi pushing it to its ultimate extreme. Otis's performance on Saturday night becomes immediately and permanently legendary. He takes the stage wearing that green suit, backed by the Stax rhythm section whose precision and power provide perfect foundation for his vocal approach. The set list is carefully chosen to demonstrate his range and emotional depth, including Shake, Respect, I've Been Loving You Too Long, Satisfaction, and Try a Little Tenderness. Each song showing different aspects of his artistry and building toward the climactic intensity that defines his live performances. From the first moments, Otis commands the audience with the same absolute authority he brings to soul venues and R&B shows, refusing to modify his approach or soften his intensity to accommodate audience expectations or prejudices. He sings with complete emotional commitment, his voice carrying pain and joy and longing and triumph with equal conviction, demonstrating that soul music's emotional directness represents sophistication rather than primitiveness, that vulnerability and power can coexist and reinforce each other. His physical presence on stage is overwhelming, his body movements suggesting someone channeling forces beyond individual control, someone allowing music to work through him rather than simply performing choreographed routines. The Monterey audience, approximately 90,000 people spread across the fairgrounds, responds to Otis's performance with growing excitement and recognition that they're witnessing something extraordinary. Many in the audience have never heard soul music performed live, have never experienced the intensity and emotional authenticity that defines the tradition Otis represents. The revelation for these predominantly white rock audiences is that soul music contains everything they value in rock: emotional honesty, innovative musicianship, refusal to compromise artistic vision, while operating according to different aesthetic principles and serving different cultural purposes. By the time Otis reaches the climax of Try a Little Tenderness, building from gentle crooning to overwhelming crescendo, the audience is completely absorbed, responding with the kind of enthusiasm and emotional engagement usually reserved for rock acts they already know and love. The performance proves definitively that soul music can reach across racial and genre boundaries when presented with sufficient power and authenticity, that the segregation keeping different audiences separated serves commercial convenience rather than reflecting genuine aesthetic incompatibility. Backstage after his performance, Otis is exhausted and exhilarated, his suit soaked with sweat, his voice temporarily hoarse from the intensity he'd brought to every song. The musicians and industry people backstage offer congratulations and recognition, acknowledging that what they've just witnessed represents one of the festival's definitive moments. But Otis, despite the obvious success, seems uncertain about how to evaluate what's happened, aware that he's connected with an audience outside his normal community, but unsure whether this represents genuine breakthrough or just momentary enthusiasm that won't translate into lasting commercial success or cultural acceptance. Sunday passes with more performances, the festival building toward its conclusion. Jimi watches some of the acts, prepares mentally and physically for his own performance, feels the pressure of knowing he's been positioned as the closing statement for a weekend that's already produced multiple historic performances and unforgettable moments. The amplifiers are adjusted, the guitar is tuned, the lighter fluid is acquired for the burning that's been planned as the performance's climax. Everything is ready for the moment that will either establish Jimi as an important figure in American music or confirm that London's enthusiasm doesn't translate to American audiences. When Jimi takes the stage Sunday evening, he brings the same uncompromising approach that Otis had brought the night before, refusing to modify his vision or soften his intensity to accommodate audience comfort or expectation. The performance includes Killing Floor, Foxy Lady, Like a Rolling Stone, Rock Me Baby, and builds toward Wild Thing, and the guitar burning that will create the festival's most iconic and controversial image. Jimi plays with technical facility and emotional intensity that demonstrates his mastery of multiple traditions: blues, rock, R&B, psychedelia, while transforming all of them into something that doesn't quite fit any existing category. The response is complex and divided. Some of the audience is mesmerized and transformed, recognizing immediately that they're witnessing revolutionary innovation that will change rock guitar permanently. Others are confused or disturbed by the sexual energy and aggressive sonic assault, unsure whether Jimi's approach represents artistic breakthrough or theatrical excess. The guitar burning crystallizes these contradictions, creating an image so powerful and ambiguous that it can be interpreted as destruction or creation, violence or sacrifice, contempt for instruments or ultimate commitment to music's transcendent possibilities. Backstage after the burning, while the guitar's remains are still being gathered and photographers are developing the images that will define Jimi's career and rock music's iconography. Otis Redding approaches Jimi. The photograph captures their meeting, but the context and circumstances can be reconstructed from multiple witnesses who remember seeing them together, who recall the intensity and seriousness of their conversation, who recognized that something significant was being communicated, even if they couldn't hear the specific words or weren't paying close enough attention to remember exactly what was said. What we know from various accounts is that Otis initiated the conversation, that he sought out Jimi specifically to talk about the performance he'd just witnessed, that his approach wasn't casual or perfunctory, but carried the weight of genuine artistic recognition and respect. Multiple witnesses describe Otis's demeanor as serious and focused, his body language suggesting someone delivering important message rather than just offering polite compliments or professional courtesy. The fragments that witnesses remember, the pieces of conversation recalled in later interviews and memoirs, suggest that Otis was talking about artistic courage and about the necessity of refusing compromise, regardless of audience response or commercial pressure. Someone remembers Otis saying something about playing your truth or staying true to your vision. Another recalls hearing Otis acknowledge that what Jimi had done with the guitar burning was controversial but important, that creating images and moments that challenge and disturb is part of an artist's responsibility when the times demand it. Several witnesses remember Otis specifically comparing Jimi's approach to soul music's emotional directness, suggesting that both traditions share commitment to authenticity and emotional honesty, even though they manifest those principles differently. Otis apparently recognized that Jimi's sonic experimentation and his theatrical intensity served the same purpose as soul music's vocal power and emotional vulnerability, both approaches refusing to hide or protect themselves, both choosing exposure and risk over safety and calculation. What Otis said about Jimi's racial position and about the challenge of being a black artist working in musical territory that white audiences and industry assume belongs to white musicians is less clearly remembered, but several people recall Otis addressing this directly. He apparently acknowledged the difficulty and importance of what Jimi was doing, creating new possibilities for where black artists could work and what kinds of music they could make without being confined to genres and market categories that the industry used to separate and control them. The emotional center of the conversation, the thing that multiple witnesses remember even without being able to quote specific words, was Otis's recognition of Jimi as fellow artist working at the highest level, someone whose approach was completely different from Otis's own, but whose commitment and courage and innovation deserved the same respect and recognition that Otis himself had earned. There was no condescension or qualified praise, no suggestion that Jimi's rock music was less important than soul, or that his experimental approach was gimmickry rather than genuine innovation. Otis treated Jimi as peer and equal, as someone engaged in parallel struggle to create honest music despite commercial pressures and racial expectations that demanded compromise and conformity. Jimi's response, according to witnesses, was quiet and absorbed, listening with the kind of focused attention that suggested he recognized the value of what Otis was offering. Several people remember Jimi expressing admiration for Otis's Monterey performance, acknowledging that seeing Otis command that audience with pure vocal power and emotional authenticity had been inspiring and educational, showing Jimi that connection with audiences didn't require the kind of theatrical gestures and sonic experimentation that Jimi deployed, that power could come from vulnerability and emotional directness as effectively as from volume and visual spectacle. The conversation apparently extended to discussing the business side of music, the challenges both faced in trying to maintain artistic integrity while dealing with industry pressures and commercial expectations. Otis, being slightly older and more established, apparently offered some advice or perspective about staying focused on the music itself rather than on the industry machinery, about remembering that commercial success matters less than artistic honesty, about not allowing the pursuit of approval or market share to corrupt the vision that made the music important in the first place. How long they talked isn't precisely documented, but witnesses describe it as substantial conversation rather than brief exchange, suggesting 15 or 20 minutes of focused dialogue amid the backstage chaos of a festival's closing night. Other musicians apparently recognized the importance of what was happening and gave them space, not interrupting or demanding attention, allowing this moment of mutual recognition and respect to develop without interference. When they finally separated, heading toward different obligations and the individual paths their careers would follow after Monterey. Multiple witnesses describe a sense that something important had been exchanged, that both artists were changed in subtle but significant ways by the conversation, that recognition and respect had been offered and received in ways that would influence how each understood their own work and their place in American music's evolving landscape. The aftermath of Monterey unfolded rapidly for both artists. Otis's performance became legendary, cited as proof that soul music could reach beyond its traditional audience when presented with sufficient power and authenticity. Music critics who had dismissed R&B as primitive or emotionally excessive revised their opinions after witnessing what Otis could do, recognizing that soul music's directness represented sophistication rather than simplicity, that emotional vulnerability required courage rather than indicating weakness. The commercial impact seemed promising. Otis's album sales increased following Monterey. His bookings expanded beyond traditional soul venues to include rock festivals and concerts where white audiences came seeking the kind of authentic emotional experience that Otis provided. There was genuine sense that Monterey had opened doors that had previously been closed, that Otis was positioned to become crossover phenomenon who could maintain credibility with his core audience while reaching the mainstream markets that represented larger commercial opportunities. For Jimi, Monterey achieved exactly what his management hoped, introducing him to American audiences in spectacular and unforgettable fashion, creating images and generating coverage that positioned him as important and innovative artist rather than as novelty or curiosity. The guitar burning became immediately iconic, reproduced in newspapers and magazines, discussed and debated and analyzed as representing either the future of rock music or its moral decay depending on the commentator's perspective. But for both artists, the most important impact of Monterey may have been the mutual recognition that their backstage conversation represented, the acknowledgement that artists working in different traditions and serving different audiences shared fundamental commitments to honesty and innovation and courage that transcended genre boundaries and racial categories. That conversation represented what Monterey made possible at its best: genuine artistic community and mutual respect, crossing the boundaries that the music industry and American society generally maintained to keep different traditions and different audiences separated and hierarchically organized. 6 months after Monterey, on December 10, 1967, Otis Redding died when the plane carrying him and his band crashed into Lake Monona in Wisconsin. He was 26 years old, at the absolute peak of his creative powers and commercial success, positioned to become one of American music's most important and influential artists. His death robbed music of a voice and presence that could never be replaced, ended a career that had only begun to reach its full potential, created permanent absence in soul music and American culture that continues to be felt decades later. The song "Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay," recorded just days before his death, was released posthumously and became Otis's first #1 pop hit, achieving in death the crossover success that Monterey had suggested was possible. The song's melancholy and introspection, its sense of being adrift and searching for purpose, took on additional poignancy knowing that Otis wouldn't be alive to experience the success or to develop the artistic possibilities the song suggested. When Jimi heard about Otis's death, he was reportedly devastated, mourning not just the loss of a great artist, but the loss of someone who had offered recognition and respect at a crucial moment, who had treated Jimi as peer and equal when Jimi was still establishing himself and still uncertain whether American audiences would accept what he was offering. Jimi spoke about Otis in interviews after his death, describing the Monterey encounter and expressing regret that they hadn't had more time to talk, to learn from each other, to potentially collaborate or create music together that would have crossed soul and rock boundaries in ways that seemed increasingly possible after Monterey's demonstrations of how different traditions could coexist and mutually enrich. 3 years later, on September 18, 1970, Jimi Hendrix died in London at age 27, his death occurring in circumstances that remain debated and mysterious. His career ended just as he was beginning to explore new musical directions that suggested evolution beyond the power trio format and the guitar-centric approach that had defined the experience. Like Otis, Jimi died with enormous potential unrealized, with artistic possibilities unexplored, leaving music poorer for the absence of someone whose innovation and courage had reshaped what was possible in rock music. The musicians who had been at Monterey, who had witnessed both performances and who had seen that backstage conversation between Otis and Jimi, spoke about both deaths with particular grief and frustration, recognizing that these weren't just individual tragedies, but were losses for American music and American culture that couldn't be calculated or compensated. They talked about Monterey as a moment of possibility, of different traditions recognizing and respecting each other, of barriers beginning to dissolve, and about how those possibilities were foreclosed by deaths that came far too soon. The specific words that Otis said to Jimi in that backstage conversation remain lost, transformed into one of music history's permanent mysteries that we can see documented in photographs but cannot hear in recordings or read in transcripts. But the meaning and importance of that conversation survived in the memories of witnesses who recognized that something significant was being exchanged, that mutual recognition and respect were being offered and received, that two artists from different traditions were acknowledging their shared commitment to honesty and innovation, regardless of commercial pressure or audience expectation. What we know is that Otis sought out Jimi specifically to acknowledge what he'd witnessed, that the conversation was substantial rather than perfunctory, that both artists emerged from it changed in ways that influenced how they understood their own work and their place in music's evolution. We know that Otis recognized Jimi's courage and innovation, that he compared Jimi's approach to soul music's emotional directness in ways that suggested they shared fundamental values despite different techniques. We know that Jimi received this recognition with gratitude and that Otis's acknowledgement mattered to him, providing validation from someone whose artistic integrity and power Jimi deeply respected. The photograph of them together, captured by someone whose timing and instinct preserved that moment for history, shows two young men at the peak of their powers, both carrying the confidence and exhaustion that comes from performing at the highest level, both aware that they've done something important even if they can't fully anticipate what the consequences will be. Otis's hand on Jimi's shoulder, both men's expressions showing serious engagement and genuine connection, the background chaos of the festival visible but not intruding on their conversation. The image captures something essential about what Monterey represented and what both artists embodied. When you listen to Otis Redding singing "Try a Little Tenderness" with voice and heart completely exposed, holding nothing back, using vulnerability as power rather than as weakness, and when you listen to Jimi Hendrix playing "Wild Thing" with his Stratocaster producing sounds that shouldn't be possible, transforming limitation into possibility and destruction into creation, you're hearing artists who shared commitment to truth and authenticity and courage, even though their methods were completely different and their traditions seemed categorically separate. The conversation that happened between them backstage at Monterey, the words that Otis spoke and that Jimi heard, represented recognition of that shared commitment, acknowledgement that genre boundaries and racial categories and commercial expectations shouldn't prevent artists from recognizing and respecting each other's work. That whatever specific wisdom or encouragement or perspective Otis offered in that moment came from someone who understood what it cost to remain authentic and uncompromising, who knew the pressures and temptations and challenges that artists face when commercial success requires conformity and when audiences demand repetition rather than evolution. We'll never know exactly what Otis said to Jimi in those minutes backstage at Monterey, while the smell of burned guitar still hung in the air and photographers were developing images that would become permanent and iconic. But we know it mattered, that witnesses recognized its importance even without being able to preserve its content, that both artists carried something from that conversation into their subsequent work and their understanding of what they were attempting to achieve. The mystery isn't failure of documentation, but is testament to privacy and intimacy, that even in public spaces, even amid festival chaos, human connection can create moments that belong only to the people sharing them, that resist capture and preservation even as their importance is recognized by everyone who witnesses them. Otis Redding and Jimi Hendrix both played Monterey in June 1967. Both transformed American music that weekend. Both died tragically young. And what Otis said to Jimi backstage, the recognition and respect and wisdom he offered, remains one of music's permanent mysteries, visible in photographs, remembered as important by witnesses, but ultimately private and lost, belonging only to two artists who recognized in each other something essential and who shared moment of genuine human connection amid the chaos and spectacle of revolutionary weekend that changed everything.